Not Quite Right features discussions that are unfiltered and uncensored and may include themes that are inappropriate for younger listeners. Also, I swear a lot.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the third of our Daredevils for the January 2025 Not Quite Right prize.
Mm-hmm.
So the January round prompts, just as a reminder, were the word ring, the action opening a door, and the anti-prompt, which is break the rule, write what you know. Also, as a reminder, our Daredevils are people who have signed up for the privilege of having their stories ripped apart and analysed
Eviscerated.
in excruciating detail.
And just to apologise, there's some tweeting birds. I don't know if they're coming through on the audio, but it is an absolute sauna in here. And so we've had to open the window and the door.
Yeah, it was either die of overheating or open a window.
Yeah,
so
we went with
you have to
open
deal
a
with the
window.
birds today.
Yeah, they're very sweet.
So our daredevil for this episode is Stephanie Hewat Simmonds, who's actually a new entrant this round, who's just
going in hard.
gone straight in.
Brave / questionable life choices kind of situation.
That's right. And so Stephanie's story this round is called I Remember. And I think it's my turn to read this one out.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here is I Remember by Stephanie Hewat Simmonds. I think I've got that disease. This is a common topic of conversation during my weekly catch-ups with Mum. What disease? You know, the one you get when you're old. Incontinence? I deliberately tease. She narrows her eyes. No, that one where you forget everything, you know? Dementia, that's it. I sit up straight now. Mum has always been a hypochondriac. But forgetting the name for dementia doesn't sound good. Why do you think that? Because I keep forgetting things. I can't remember the words for things. When I walk into a room, I can't remember what I went in for. I calm down a bit. This doesn't sound so bad. I try to think of something reassuring to say. I don't think you need to worry, Mum. I saw a program about dementia. This doctor said if you forget the word for spoon, my eyes land on the first thing I see on the table. That's old age. If you forget what a spoon is for, that's dementia. Mum's eyes light up. Oh, good. That makes sense. We move on to other topics, but she plants a seed in my mind that festers and grows. Mummy's getting quite forgetful, missing appointments, calling my brother by her ex-husband's name. I set her little tests. Mum, what's the name of your neighbour again? I want to send them a Christmas card. Sometimes she gets it right, and sometimes she gets it wrong. It comes to a head a few weeks later when I invite her over for Sunday lunch. I cook her favourite, goulash. She remembers the invite right up until the day before. But on Sunday, she doesn't turn up. I pull out my phone to ring her neighbour when the doorbell chimes. I run to the door and pull it open. Mum, it's you. I was worried. Whatever for? You know how bad that bus is. Now stop fussing and let me in. She walks in, handing me a bottle of Hungarian Red. Perfect to go with lunch. Goulash, right? I breathe out, feeling my shoulders relax. We fill our glasses, and I suggest to Mum that she serves while I get the bread. When I come back, I see Mum, frozen. Mum, are you okay? She doesn't respond. Mum! Sorry, darling, she says, holding up the serving spoon. Whatever is this for? So thank you, Stephanie, for your story. And Stephanie also put some more context in her brief explanation field, so I'll read that out to you as well. She says, this story came from my reflection that I had never had the experience of a family member starting to get dementia. It's not an experience I'd ever given a lot of thought to or been drawn to writing about. So I decided to consider the experience of someone not knowing if their family member has dementia or not. To respond to the prompt, break the rule of write what you know. Yeah, so Stephanie, you've written here about a subject that we actually called out in the past on our flash fiction tropes discussion.
Yeah.
And dementia is a common topic that we do read about as flash fiction. But I think what your story does well is not go for like the shock value necessarily. I think it is quite sensitively handled.
Yeah, I think that trope twisty kind of thing is all about how we're sort of set up to see one thing and then it turns out the point of view character is the one with dementia. I think that's really the trope that we see. Whereas this, like, obviously it's a pivotal life event, right? For many people, especially now as the population gets older. And this is something that is almost like a life stage for everyone who is lucky enough to live that long, right? And so I think it's a valid topic to cover. And so I certainly don't think like don't do it. You know, we have this list of tropes, and if you're new, you can head to the website and look up the article, which is like the flash fiction tropes, to see the kinds of stories that we read often. But that's not to say we don't want to read them, right? That's just sort of to say, look, you need to go somewhere a little bit deeper with this for it to resonate, because as a concept alone, it's not enough. But I think you're right. I think here Stephanie has handled it with care and given us something that feels more resonant and real.
And I think you've come at it from a position of honesty. And even though it's not a situation that as you've said, you haven't experienced it yourself, you've depicted two characters who are working through it in an authentic way. We do get something in the end that resembles a little bit of a twist, but it feels more earned, I feel, in this scenario.
Yeah, and it's more a progression of the plot rather than like a, aha, twist, gotcha, you know. And that's what I think. We've talked about twists before, this kind of like the author is more clever than you and they gotcha. Like that's not satisfying as a reading experience usually. What is satisfying is like, okay, this story has evolved and here's the climax of the story that flowed naturally from the events, which is what we got here.
So I'll also say this story didn't make the long list, but it wasn't too far off.
Yeah.
We gave it a maybe plus and a maybe. So it was one of those that was fairly close to the cusp, basically. It was considered for inclusion in the long list.
Yeah. So I hope that our discussion now sheds some light onto why maybe this particular story didn't make the long list. And then for those of you who are listening in, maybe you can see some similarities with your story and maybe why that didn't make the long list. Because I think it bears mentioning, and we've already said this in the long list announcement episode, like there were a lot of stories that were really great that didn't make the long list. And not making the long list is not like a you can't write or this story sucks. Like it just really isn't.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, there's definitely ticks, there's good points here, and we'll go into them, like the things that you've done really well. And then there's things that are maybe like we can challenge, like from a technical perspective, but ultimately it all comes down to like what stories resonated with us at that time. And, you know, that's incredibly subjective. And if you handed the exact same batch of stories to a different couple of judges, you'd get a different result. So it's not as simple as sort of saying, oh, my story was better. Like that's such a subjective assessment, I guess. And so our role here is to share with you our subjective assessment and the things for us, the triggers, the good and the bad, and the reasons, I guess, that differentiate a long listing story from a story that just doesn't quite get there.
All right, so let's get into the story in a bit more detail. And let's start with, as we usually do, the title. And the title of this story is I Remember, which is a very short title. We've commented on the last couple of episodes. The titles have been quite long. So this one's
is like the opposite end of that spectrum.
I don't need to take a breath in between the middle of this one. So yeah, what do you think about the title?
Look, I think there's nothing wrong with this title, but I would challenge Stephanie to consider, is this a memorable title? And I don't think it is. Like it doesn't link directly to any line in this story, for example.
Yeah.
And while this whole story is about like remembering and forgetting, that line, I remember, it sort of doesn't connect to the point of view character and is more of a generic statement. So again, coming off my high horse, someone who has a very questionable title for my work in progress novel. I'm not here to sort of pass judgment on that. It's more to sort of say, hey, like, is this the most compelling title that you could come up with? And I'm not sure that it is.
I think I felt the same way. I Remember doesn't quite connect with the story directly, but it almost does. I mean, obviously the themes of remembering are there, and we have repetition of I don't remember in the story. And I think with a little bit of tweaking, you might have been able to get that story title to resonate very heavily with the story in a way that, again, talk about this all the time, post-single effect. You can bring the title into that single effect, right, and have that title resonate in a way and remind you of the story and make you think of the story more deeply. I don't think it would have taken much in the way of tweaking to have that motif maybe of I remember being reinforced a little bit through that story.
Yeah, like you could feed I remember into the story through dialogue, for example, or looking in reverse, like what is the most memorable part of this story? I would say it's that spoon concept. Yeah. And so bringing the spoon into the title might have helped link the title to, I guess, the theme of the story. But, you know, once again, as we always say, this isn't a deal breaker. This isn't why your story does or does not make the long list. It's just something to think about.
All right. So we open with the line of dialogue. I think I've got that disease. And this is a common topic of conversation during my weekly catch-ups with Mum. So I think that line, I think I've got that disease, can be a compelling line of dialogue. It sets up, I wouldn't say necessarily conflict, but that there is like an issue here that's being explored. And the next little kind of interjected line, we know that we are with the main character's weekly catch-ups with Mum. So it sets up the characters. We don't really know anyone's name at this stage, and we don't really know where we are. Not sure how important that is for this scene to be set. We can kind of imagine one of a number of places that they could be. So, yeah, I think there's a few things that you can do there to make the visual of that scene stand out a bit more strongly in the reader's mind. Like, where are they? Yeah. What's around them? Are they in a cafe? Are they in someone's lounge room kind of thing?
Yeah, and those were my thoughts as well. I mean, I will say I was a little bit triggered by that opening line just because it's unattributed dialogue. And again, just remembering that we are coming into this cold. We've just read like however many other stories from science fiction to comedy to dark, like disturbing stuff. And we're coming to your story cold with just your title, which is very simple, I remember. And then the first line is a line of unattributed dialogue that says, I think I've got that disease. Now, from the start, we have no picture in our mind. There is nothing. There is just those words. And so I think it is important, very important, to give us who is saying that. And it's implied in the following line, but I don't think that's enough. I would challenge that. And again, this is a pet peeve and it's subjective, and it's not to say you can't lead with a line of unattributed dialogue, but I would say in a story of 500 words where you're trying to get, in this case, it's a competition, you're trying to get judges on board very quickly, then it helps to really set the scene very quickly. And while you say, Ed, like, in this scene, it's not so important to know the setting. Like, we can kind of infer that as we go along, that they're sitting somewhere having a cup of tea kind of situation. And that's true. And it's not like there's something missing there. It's not like I'm confused as we go along. Whereas some stories you might need scene setting to get rid of that confusion, either like in terms of the time or the place. I didn't feel confused, but I do think that immersion wasn't there. Yeah. Like, I'm not in that scene yet. I'm sort of hovering out here waiting for something to happen. And if you can very quickly tell us where we are and set that scene, not just in like a vague detail like we're in a lounge room, but to choose a detail which also has that Poe effect, right? Contributes to the theme here, the remembering, this relationship between the mother and the child. I think that's a more compelling place to start. So, for example, you could choose a lounge room, okay? And I do think it's important because I think that spoon comes in later. Yeah. So I think setting up already that we're like having a cup of tea would be a great lead-in for later, that spoon appearing, for example. Like if, you know, we're starting with the tinkle of a teaspoon around a cup, like you could have that sort of sensory detail which gets paid off later. But also you could use that lounge room to sort of evoke those memories perhaps. Like, is it Mum's lounge room? Is this the sort of lounge room that we've had all these life experiences in, that we're conjuring these memories? Or is it a cafe? And what does that mean? Like, that's telling us a little bit about this relationship that this mother and child are like catching up weekly at the cafe. Like, you can use those settings to sort of deepen that experience as well. So it's not wasted words, in my opinion. Okay, so just jumping forward a few lines, we've got, I sit up straight now. Mum has always been a hypochondriac, but forgetting the name for dementia doesn't sound good. Now, that to me was quite a compelling line. Like, she's always been a hypochondriac. Great. That sets up our character a little bit here. And I can think of some real people that I know that are represented there. And then she's always been a hypochondriac, but forgetting the name of dementia doesn't sound good. That is really like a hook to me. And you could bring that even sooner in the story. I think that's a great hook. But I would say, and this is like such a nitpick, so whatever, take it with a grain of salt, but I would change that to, but forgetting the name for dementia isn't good.
Yeah.
Right? It's such a little difference, but just that like snappy, getting that idea out more quickly, removing that filtering of the doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
Like our character is
more
hearing
direct.
this. Yeah, being more direct. I think it gets such a nitpick, but it does give more impact, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
For a line like that, that's like a powerful line. You want it to just really hit as hard as possible.
Yeah, and sometimes there can be a temptation to hedge a little bit and use words like almost, or I think it helps just to be very direct and very clear with what you're trying to say.
And ramp up that drama.
Yeah.
It's not, doesn't sound good. It's not good, right? It's scary. Uh-oh. Like, where's this coming from? All out of the blue kind of thing.
Yeah. And I do like this interplay of the relationship over the next few lines. Like they're exploring this idea, and there's a false sense of security, I think, that the main character, the perspective character, feels when, it's a common experience. You walk into a room, I can't remember what I went in for. Yeah. And that's the scary thing about dementia is that like...
Where's the line?
Where is the line? And everyone has some of the symptoms some of the time.
And speaking as a perimenopausal woman,
which you do a lot.
That's exclusively what I do these days. But this idea of forgetting your words and not finding your words, and it gets worse with age, and it's kind of pronounced. You sort of suddenly notice that you can't find the words for things. And so, like you say, like that line between what's just normal getting old or what's just normal I'm distracted versus what's there to worry about.
Yeah, and I love that idea of the spoons for helping to draw that distinction. So not just for the mum, but for the readers as well. So when mum's like, oh yeah, that's reassuring, it's like, yeah, that's actually reassuring for me as well.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard that, and I'm not sure if Stephanie has made that up or read that somewhere and
she
kind of
must have read
adapted
it
it to
somewhere.
the story. But yeah, that's a really powerful idea, and I think that's a really good hook and centre for the story.
Yeah, and it comes sort of maybe a third of the way through the story, and I do think that's something for us to latch onto.
Yeah.
And then like
what it does is for the rest of the story, it sticks in your mind and it kind of frames the rest of the story in that context.
Yeah. And so then when that's paid off in the ending, that's like very good. There's a line here that I'll just call out. So we've got after the mother says, oh, when I walk into a room, I can't remember what I went in there for. And of course, that's incredibly relatable. The POV character, it says, I calm down a bit. This doesn't sound so bad. I try to think of something reassuring to say. So again, we all calm down because we're like, oh yeah, that's not so bad. But I would say for that line, that's a little bit telling. So if we go back to that old advice of show, don't tell, I calm down a bit. What does that look like?
Yeah.
How does that feel in the body? We're storytellers, and it's okay to take shortcuts sometimes to just cut to the chase. But I think when it's this emotional stuff, it bears mentioning, like what's the actual physical and perhaps verbal reaction in that moment. So when mum says that, well, what do you say next? Or how do we witness that? And like a simple thing would be like I unclench my jaw or something like that. And that's pretty generic in itself. It's great if you can find something a little bit more compelling to say, but nevertheless, it's all more compelling than just telling us you've relaxed. And going on to say, this doesn't sound so bad, I try and think of something reassuring to say. Like all of that can be encapsulated in action and dialogue, I think, and doesn't need to be spelled out for the reader because it's fairly straightforward stuff.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's also a risk that you're working to establish this drama and this tension in the scene. And by inserting like I calm down a bit or things aren't as bad as I thought, you're just ramping it down.
Yeah.
So you can just skip that entire line and move to the next line. I don't think you need to worry, Mum.
Yeah.
That is an interplay between the characters, and you do want to maintain a little bit of that anxiety of the scene.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the underlying thematic message here. And if we look at Stephanie's comments, like in the brief description around, I was trying to sort of explore what it's like to have someone who's going through that, then tension anxiety. Like that's what this is all about, right? Like mum says something a bit funny and it's like, oh shit, here we go. And probably for many of us in this age bracket, we're in that age bracket of like, okay, everything's good, but like we know it's not going to be good forever. And when's that axe going to fall? And this story is all about when that axe falls, basically, or when we think it falls and then when it does. And so absolutely in terms of post-single effect that we talk about, like trying to establish this single emotional impact on the reader, keeping that anxiety and tension high is a good choice for this story.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we have a big time jump here as well. So we go from like this scene where they're having their weekly catch up and then we get to this line of, we move on to other topics, but she plants a seed in my mind that festers and grows. Mum is getting quite forgetful, missing appointments, calling my brother by her ex-husband's name. So we can imagine like months are passing here. And, you know, our typical advice is to keep flash fiction like pretty much within one scene most of the time. Obviously, that's not like a hard and fast rule, but we're trying to like find the crux of the matter here. We're trying to find the one scene that's like the pivotal scene, the pivotal moment that really encapsulates this feeling. So spanning across months, it's okay. We're still on theme here. We're still very much on the topic and maybe it's appropriate to give a little bit of a time span for this to evolve. But at the same time, like I feel like keeping it within the scene keeps it more like dynamic and impactful potentially.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think in this specific scenario, Stephanie is writing about a situation that is evolving over time, right? So it is difficult and sometimes you need that time jump. I think that the way that this is handled is reasonably transparent. There are definitely ways that I think you can streamline that transition and that jump, but I think overall it is not an abrupt cut.
Like I agree with you. Like I do think it's handled very well here. I certainly didn't feel like, what's happening? Like, why are we doing this? I guess it's just something to consider. Like, can we keep this tight? It's for your own sake, like for word count reasons, keeping it all together. But you're right. Maybe it is completely appropriate to have that time evolve, like to have this sort of get worse, I guess, over time.
So the next line after the time jump, we begin our new scene. It comes to a head a few weeks later when I invite her over for Sunday lunch.
Just a little logic question, I guess. So in that paragraph at the end, we say, I pull out my phone to ring her neighbour when the doorbell chimes. And my question is like, why didn't you ring mum? Why have you jumped to ringing the neighbour? That's sort of jumping to a conclusion a little bit. We haven't established like that you can't contact your mum.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a throwaway little minor thing.
I know my mother-in-law doesn't have a phone. She's quite elderly.
So but we've had these weekly chats and whatever. So like, I don't know.
A little bit more just to kind of cement that idea in place.
Like, why are you freaking out? Like, you haven't actually tried to make contact with your mum and failed yet. And look, maybe that was one of those things that got edited out when the word count got short because it is a very, very minor detail, but...
You mentioned the word count, and this was a short story. If you look at the word count, it was only just over 400 words.
Oh, wow.
To our count.
Doesn't feel like that.
So there is some room to work with there, and I think we've got a lot of dialogue in this story, which is great. Very active, a lot of action happening in the scene. But yeah, I think there was more room there to explore these ideas a bit more deeply.
So moving forward to when mum arrives and she's off the bus and she's saying, stop fussing and let me in. And I will say too, you've just mentioned that there's a bit of dialogue. Dialogue did feel nice and natural. I think it felt real, which is good. So well done. So then when we get to, she walks in handing me a bottle of Hungarian red. Now, again, we're nitpicking here, but like whatever, like if you want to go on to maybe submit this for publication and so on, maybe this is stuff that you might want to consider looking at. So we've got, she walks in, and to me, that's a meaningless line. Like it's stage direction, which can be helpful. Like if the reader can't figure out where people are moving in the scene, it's important to give that information. I don't think that information is particularly necessary here. She's at the door. We know she's going to come inside. So therefore, I would say that's an opportunity to give us a little bit more information. How does she walk in? How's she moving her body? What's she sort of doing and saying that's even more alarming? Like if we're trying to keep that tension up, okay, it's a relief. Mum's arrived. Oh, a relief. Oh, shit. Something weird's just happened. Like why is she acting strange? That could be an opportunity to push that tension. And yes, it would require a few more words, but as you've indicated, there were words to spare, so we could afford that. So she walks in handing me a bottle of Hungarian red. Now, does she walk in and hand it to you? Like, those are fairly innocuous statements. Like, could we give a little bit more punch to that action? How does she stagger in? Does she sort of burst in? Like, and what does that mean? Does she hand you the bottle, or is she almost just like shoving it in your hands to try and almost like prove herself? You know, like these things that could add tension to this idea of mum's not quite there.
Yeah.
Like, and this is not normal behavior. Like, it's great that she remembers we're having goulash, but why is she kind of rushing and why is she pushing? So I guess I feel like that's a missed opportunity to add a little bit more drama there.
Also on that sentence, I liked those details of the Hungarian red and the goulash because we're sending up this picture of the mother. I don't know if you had the same impression, but the mother is probably Hungarian. Like that's why it's her favourite meal.
Yeah.
So now I've developed a picture of like an immigrant family. I don't know where this is set, but probably not in Hungary.
Not Hungary.
And so we now have this added detail of the mother that kind of comes in at the end as an extra detail. And I always feel like you don't want to shift the picture that the reader has in their head towards the end. You want to kind of enhance that. So it would have been great to see some of these details happen earlier on that now get reinforced. You know, could have introduced an accent or something earlier on that then gets developed into this Hungarian heritage.
Yeah, or a little bit of backstory as if, you know, she's struggling with her memories of the past versus how things are very different now. Like maybe she's caught a little bit in the past of perhaps where she's come from. And that's why goulash is like such a reassuring, calming meal for her. Like,
or maybe that she starts to forget English words, but she remembers Hungarian words.
Yeah, that could be a good way of handling it as well. I mean, these are all just ideas that I think would maybe enrich what is already like a compelling idea here. But to really leap off the page and be something special, these are ways that you can like make it feel more unique and make it feel more personal to these characters. It's not just a mother and daughter. Like, it's these people.
Yeah.
Just extending from what I said before about the previous line about walking in and so on. So the next line is, I breathe out, feeling my shoulders relax. Now, again, there's an opportunity here for that action to be a little bit more compelling and dynamic and like something more stressful, I guess, to be happening to like keep the reader on edge a little bit. Like, why are you breathing out and relaxing? Like, you have an opportunity here to actually react strongly to how mum has strangely walked in the door, for example, even though she's brandishing a bottle of Hungarian red and even though we know she's remembered, and that's kind of a relief, there's still something not quite right here. But also on a more technical level, we've got some filtering here. So we have, I breathe out, feeling my shoulders relax. So this word feeling is what we would lump into the basket of filtering. So filtering is where you present something through the perspective of your point of view character, but it's sort of like...
Yeah, you're describing it as not happening directly, but you're describing it as they feel something or they see something or they hear something.
Yeah, it's through their perception. Yeah. So these words like feel, saw, looked, smelled, like just present the experience without telling us it was experienced, like if that makes sense. So rather than I breathe out feeling my shoulders relax, it would be I breathe out my shoulders relax. And it's a subtle change, but it does on a deeper level. And when you get sort of more into the realm of this sensory detail, it actually helps the reader embody that character. So rather than like telling me I feel this, now the reader is feeling it. And that's, I guess, the objective we're going for here.
Yeah. But still that is a good sentence from the perspective of, you know, showing and not telling. So she's not saying now everything's cool or the character feels relaxed. They're saying they're giving physical examples of what that means to them and how the character is experiencing that.
Yeah, so it's difficult because we get this show don't tell advice all the time, but there's like layers of it and it just never ends, right? Like we've got showing, but then we also need to remove filtering from that showing. And that's a higher order skill, and it's something that I think people do naturally sometimes and then also easily forget. So it's just one of those things to look out for when you're editing your story. It's not something I'd be conscious of when you're doing your first draft, but you can actually Google like filtering words, right? And then you can search them in your story and you'll quickly see how removing them helps to like bring an immediacy to what you're writing. Now we get to the spoon part, which I think is the most compelling part of this story. And it is a great hook. And I think it's paid off well by the end. We have this line here where we say, we fill our glasses and I suggest to Mum that she serves while I get the bread. Now, because I know at the end we talk about this spoon, I think that's an opportunity to insert the spoon into the action. Okay, so rather than just I suggest to Mum that she serves, pass her the spoon.
Yeah.
Do that there, and it's a little thing, but that's setting up what happens next. And I think that's always important to consider as well.
And it might help avoid some of these, as you say, stage directions of leaving the room and coming back as well. Like she could directly hand the spoon to the mother and the mother says, what is this for?
Yeah.
So just make it happen a little bit quicker and more immediate in the scene.
Yeah, I think that would work as well because ultimately that's the climax of this story. That's what we're building to. And I do think it got a little bit lost here. It sort of petered out a little bit, whereas we want that to be like, bam.
Yeah.
We want that to be, oof, that got me. And I think, like you say, bringing that action into the present moment and not sort of stepping away, coming back would help.
Yeah, but what I think you've done really well here, Stephanie, is the point that you've chosen to end this story on that moment, on that key moment of what is this spoon for? And you kind of let that sit there and let that sit there with the reader to think about. Because you could have added another line, as often happens, of, you know, I was left there shocked kind of thing. It doesn't need to be there. And you've resisted that temptation. I think that is the perfect line to end on for that impact.
No, I agree. I think that's a really powerful ending. And something that we're often trying to achieve in flash fiction is circularity, which is like completing the circle from the beginning to the end. So whatever's introduced or suggested in the title or the opening lines, that is paid off at the end. Because this is just like a short story, brief scene, that's commonly a nice, satisfying way of like leaving your story. And I think you've done that really well. So that's like a huge tick from me. That would have gone a long way in this case for like raising your story in our estimation. Just that satisfying, like, yep, got it. The point of your story has been delivered. And whereas we've challenged some of the other stories this round in terms of leaving like a bit of a cliffhanger, I think this was a perfect example where you have actually given us everything we need as readers to connect all the dots and to have that be a satisfying ending. So I think that's a huge tick. That's one of the biggest challenges is sticking that landing, and you've done that. So well done.
Yeah. And look, I think we're at the end of the story, and I think we've given a lot of little moments that you can improve, but all of the fundamentals are really there in this story. And, you know, as evidenced by the fact that it did narrowly miss out on a long listing, and where it could be improved are, you know, all of these elements of just making the links stronger, making the emotional resonance and the emotional impact stronger. And you did have some words to play with there as well. But look, the characters are there. I do like the characters. You've managed to contain it to just 2 characters, which is great. And we do get a sense of both of them, but probably potentially less the prospective character than the mother, who we get a more clear picture of. But I'm not really left thinking, well, I'm missing major chunks of information or anything like that.
No, it's quite
more
clear.
Just, how you can amplify those little details to really point all of the emotional impact into that one scene.
Yeah, and one way of doing that is to think about the details. So we've talked about how, like, we haven't really established a setting, for example. It's not about just tell us they're in a lounge room. That's not going to add value to this story because we know they're sort of in a lounge room or something or a cafe or something. And giving that information isn't going to, like, make us love this story more. But choosing, like, a really compelling detail about the setting to draw in and emphasize your point about this anxiety, this not knowing, like what's happening to the mother. And there are ways you can do that just by looking at what's happening in the room. What are we noticing? Is there a picture on the wall? Is there something strange about the way Mum is holding her teacup? Like what is that tiny little detail that puts us on edge as a reader? And I think that kind of value adding is one way of like just lifting the story out of like just here's what happened to like, wow, this is really hitting those heartstrings kind of thing.
Yeah, and there may have been an opportunity again to emphasise like the other family history, and we wonder about where's Dad, you know, for example, and maybe that's part of the story. Maybe he died recently and that's why they have the weekly catch-ups, and maybe that's another risk factor that goes into like her potential deterioration as well.
Yeah, and you said this is about two characters, but we also have mentioned her ex-husband, who presumably is not the father, if we're calling him the ex-husband, and then the brother as well. They're mentioned in passing, which is fine, but there is an opportunity there with those extra words to use those relationships to tell us more and to sort of reveal more about the tension in this family.
But all right, so let's talk about the prompts then. Word prompts, we have during, reassuring, and phone ring, or ring as a phone ringing, right?
Yeah, and so I think it was the ringing phone that was really the one that we're focused on. Like that's what we're trying to put in here, and that's a good choice.
The action prompt is the opening of a front door, which is probably, I think we mentioned, the most common response to this prompt.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think, like, again, you know, we might challenge the immediacy of having that scene at the front door, but I think it works here. You've made it work by having that conflict of not knowing if she's arriving or not, and then she arrives. So I think
it's part of the story.
Yeah, it's part of the story, and I think that's quite clever.
And the anti-prompt, as we've discussed, is the experience of a family member starting to get dementia. And yeah, you've tackled that really well for someone who said that they haven't had any experience doing it. I think you've really been very empathetic about the characters.
So I would just challenge, just like as an extension of that, to maybe go a little bit deeper. That's all I would say. So I think it's all there. Let's put it this way. I don't think I found this story as emotionally resonant as I might have had Stephanie had that experience. Because I think some of that passion would have come through, and I don't think it necessarily did. I think it was more on the surface, and I would have liked to have seen that deeper exploration of the pain of what's happening here. Like, it's sort of shocking, but where's the pain? And I think that's an opportunity there to really basically just tighten the screws and make the reader really suffer, which is always fun as a writer. Like, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, but we have the idea of our main character here underlying this whole story. Is her anxiety and worry about her mother. Like, it's almost a matter of when for her, right? And that's the kind of stress. But maybe the stakes there also need to be a bit more apparent. Like, what does that mean if she gets it? Like, what's it going to do to her and her life and all of that kind of thing? And we can assume, but to put that on the page as well.
That was literally my note, was the stakes, right? Like, we need to, as readers, to know, like, we can fill in the blanks. Like, obviously it's alarming when a loved one is going through this. And for those of us who haven't experienced that, like, we can still figure that out. Yeah. But the specific stakes, like, if mum has dementia, what does that mean for her? Yeah. What does that mean for me, the POV character? And expressing that very clearly and in a way that's unique to these characters. So that's the stakes. Like, what happens if this is true? Well, then that helps the payoff. Later when she says, what's this spoon for? That knife gets twisted even harder because it's like, oh shit, now we know. That means this is what's happening for mum and this is what's happening for the point of view character if she's got dementia. And so, like, that's an opportunity to really, like, just go deeper. And I think we always need to be looking for those opportunities, especially if we're trying to write a story that's maybe not our own lived experience. Like, just really trying to think deeply about, like, what is this experience like, and trying to replicate that as honestly as possible. And that was the challenge of this anti-prompt. You know, it was all about authenticity, and it is very difficult to do what Stephanie's done, which is take a story that she has no experience of and make it her own. And I think that's a real genuine challenge. I think that's why this rule exists. You know, write about your own stuff because you will be able to be authentic and you'll be able to communicate that emotion. But, you know, sometimes we want to go outside our own frame of reference, and I think Stephanie's done a good job of that here. And I guess it's just a challenge to go even deeper again. Yeah.
And you're not far off, Stephanie. So well done. And thank you very much for your story.
Yeah. Like, I can't believe this is your first go. Welcome.
Well, presumably your first go at Not Quite Right.
Yeah. Like,
first
clearly, clearly you've written before. But yeah, like, welcome. And we love your style and we'd love to read more of your work.
Absolutely. All right. I think that wraps it up for this episode. And we'll be back next week with another Daredevil. And until then, ride on.
Right on.
We hope you enjoyed this special Daredevil episode of Not Quite Right. If you have thoughts on this story, follow us on social media and join the conversation. And if you'd like to participate in the next round of the competition, head over to our website at notquiteright.com. That's WRITE.
Something doesn't seem